everyone, and welcome. I remember over 20 years ago, sitting in a business school classroom and reading the case study of Mary Kay. I remember how inspired and moved I was. And today, I'm inspired, moved, grateful, and honored to be speaking with you. I'm going to talk about the science of happiness, which is not an easy topic to talk about these days. After all, levels of depression are rising. Anxiety and stress levels are at an all-time high. What is the relevance of the science of well-being today? In fact, one of my friends recently asked me, Tal, shouldn't we quarantine happiness, at least for a while, until all this pandemic and difficulties and hardships are over? Well, my answer to that is no. I think the science of happiness is more important than ever. What I'm going to do today is share with you why I think that, and more importantly, provide you some tools, techniques, and tips that you can apply in your life, both at work and at home, as a leader, as a parent, as a community member, as a friend. So, why is happiness important? Nassim Taleb, who's a professor at New York University, coined the term anti-fragility. Anti-fragility is the opposite of fragility. Specifically, it's about taking the idea of resilience to the next level. So let's begin with resilience. Resilience is the ability of certain material, body, or thing to go back to its original form after pressure or stress has been put on it. So for example, if you have a piece of rubber or ball and you squish it, if it's resilient, it goes back to where it was before. Or a ball, if it's resilient, you drop it, it bounces back up to where it was before. On a psychological level, resilience is the ability to withstand hardships and difficulties and pressure. Withstand it and go back, bounce back to where we were before. Anti-fragility takes this idea a step further. So an anti-fragile material or system, you put pressure on it, you squish it, it doesn't just go back to its original form subsequently, it actually grows bigger, stronger, better as a result of that pressure or stress. Or a ball, you drop it, if it's resilient, it bounces back to where it was before. If it's anti-fragile, it bounces back higher. That's anti-fragile, the opposite of fragile. Now, it turns out that there are anti-fragile systems all around us and even within us. Let me give you two examples. One physiological, the other is psychological. When it comes to a physiological system, we have our muscles. So, for example, you go to the gym and you lift weights. What are you doing to your muscles? You're stressing them. You're putting pressure on your muscular system. As a result of that pressure, what happens? Your muscles don't just go back to where they were before. They actually grow bigger, stronger, healthier. Our muscular system is an anti-fragile system. Let me give you one example now of a psychological anti-fragile system. So most of the students that I teach in my class, not all, but most, are psychology majors. And I always ask them the following question. I say to them, I want you to put your hand up if you've heard of PTSD. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, just about all the students put their hand up, whether they're psychology majors or not. They've heard about it, they've read about it, they've studied it in previous classes. They know what it is. And then I say to them, okay, now put your hands down. And I have a second question for you. Now, I'd like you to put your hand up if you know what PTG is. Hardly anyone puts their hand up. What is PTG? PTG is post-traumatic growth. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is being fragile, breaking down. Post-traumatic growth is anti-fragile, growing as a result of hardship, difficulty, trauma. People have heard of the former, they have rarely heard of the latter. Now here is the thing. Post-traumatic growth, anti-fragility, is twice as likely as post-traumatic stress disorder, fragility. If, and this is a big if, first of all, we know about the existence, the possibility of post-traumatic growth, of anti-fragility. Second, we know what conditions we need to put in place. In other words, first of all, we need to know that post-traumatic growth is a possibility, that it can happen. And it turns out that just knowing about this increases the likelihood that it will happen. And second, we need to know what conditions we need to put in place. And there are certain conditions. Now, most people don't know about the possibility of post-traumatic growth. Most people don't know about the conditions that we can put in place to increase the likelihood. Now, we cannot guarantee that we will grow after trauma, difficulty, hardship. But what we can do is increase the likelihood thereof. And here lies the purpose of the science of happiness in difficult times. First of all, about acquainting us with the possibility of growing from difficulty. Second, it's about helping us understand what conditions we can put in place, whether as leaders in the workplace, whether as parents at home, friends, community members, partners, in every realm of our life. Knowing about the possibility of anti-fragility, of post-traumatic growth, and second, knowing what conditions we need to put in place can contribute a great deal for our personal growth and for the growth and development of those around us. So what are some of the conditions that we can and ought to put in place so that we become better parents, partners, leaders in our personal as well as professional lives? The first topic that I wanted to talk about, the first condition to put in place for increasing the likelihood of anti-fragility, is what I've come to call the permission to be human. I first thought about this idea of the permission to be human when I taught my first class on positive psychology at Harvard. That first year, I had 8 students in my class. 2 of them dropped out, which left me with a broken ego. And I remember having lunch one day in one of the undergraduate dorms when a student who wasn't in my class walked over and said, Tal, may I join you for lunch? And I said, sure. So he sits down and then he says to me, Tal, I hear you're teaching a class on happiness. And I said, yeah, positive psychology. And then he said, you know, my roommates are taking your class. They were 2 of the 6 students, so I really had to be nice to him now. And then he sits down and then he says, Tal, but you know, now that you're teaching this class, you've got to be careful. And I said, what? And he said, Tal, you've got to watch out. And I said, why? And he said, because if I see you unhappy, I'll tell my roommates. And I actually used that in class the following day when I addressed my students, all 6 of them. I said, you know, the last thing in the world I want you to think is that I'm always happy, or that you, by the end of the semester, will experience a constant high. There are only 2 kinds of people who do not experience painful emotions such as sadness or anger or a frustration or or anxiety or envy, only two kinds of people who do not experience painful emotions. The first kind of people who don't experience painful emotions are the psychopaths. The second kind of people who don't experience painful emotions are dead. So if you experience painful emotions at times, it's actually a good sign. It means you're not a psychopath and you're alive. Good place to start. We can build on that. The problem in today's world, though, is that most of us, most of the time, do not give ourselves the permission to be human. Why? Well, there are many reasons. One of the reasons is social media. Because what do we see on social media? We see that everyone is doing great. Even during these difficult times, they're learning how to cook better, and they're cultivating more intimate relationships with their partner or friends or families, and they're learning about themselves, and they're appreciating life so much more. Everyone's doing great, except for me. Now, I don't want to be the only one who's left out, who's not doing well. So I put similar posts on my social media. Everything is great, but I'm contributing to the great deception that is largely responsible for the Great Depression. Why is not giving ourselves the permission to be human contributing to more painful emotions? Because of the paradox. You see, the paradox is that when we reject painful emotions, these emotions intensify, they grow stronger. It is when we embrace and accept painful emotions, that's when they leave just as they came. They do not overstay their welcome. There's a beautiful poem by the Sufi poet Rumi. And Rumi writes, 800 years ago or more, writes about the guest house. And in the guest house, the poem, he says that we need to invite in all emotions, all thoughts as guests. We need to welcome them. And this is very good advice. And what the research today shows, that Rumi was right. When we welcome them, they do not overstay their welcome. When we reject painful emotions, they become stronger and they affect us more negatively. Think about the following example. Okay, so I'm going to do an experiment with you. It doesn't hurt, I promise. Here's what I'd like you to do. For the next 10 seconds, do not think of a pink elephant. Do not think of a pink elephant. You know what I'm talking about? Like, Dumbo with the big ears. Do not think of a pink elephant. Now, what happened? I bet you that most of you thought of a pink elephant. Why? Because when we try to reject a natural phenomenon, such as not thinking about a word that we hear over and over again, when we try to reject a natural phenomenon, that phenomenon usually intensifies, grows stronger. It's the same with painful emotions. They're a natural phenomenon. And when we reject them, when we try to fight them, they intensify. So if I reject anxiety, I become more anxious. If I reject envy, natural human emotion, I actually become more envious. If I reject sadness, sadness just increases. And it's when I accept and embrace these emotions that they do not overstay their welcome. They leave just as they came. There is another side to the paradox. And that is that when we reject painful emotions, or attempt to, we are inadvertently, not on purpose, also rejecting pleasurable emotions. Why? Because all emotions, no exception, flow through the same pipeline. Not two pipelines of emotions, one emotional pipeline. In other words, when I block painful emotions or try to do so, I'm inadvertently blocking the free flow of pleasurable emotions. In other words, if I block sadness, I'm also stopping joy from flowing freely through me. If I fight against anxiety, I'm also preventing myself from fully experiencing excitement. If I fight against envy, I'm not allowing myself to love freely. In the words of Golda Meir, who was Prime Minister of Israel back in the 1970s, those who don't know how to weep with their whole heart don't know how to laugh either. One emotional pipeline, two sides of the same coin. Now, when I talk about giving ourselves the permission to be human, I'm not talking about resignation. Rather, what I'm talking about is active acceptance. So this is not about resigning and saying, well, there's nothing I can do about these emotions. Let me just be, just sit in front of the TV for 3 months now. No, I'm talking about actively accepting the emotion, which means allowing the emotion to flow through me and then choosing the most appropriate course of action. Embracing, accepting the emotion, and choosing the most appropriate course of action. You see, I can accept envy, which is a natural human emotion towards my best friend, say, and still act in a generous and benevolent way. In fact, when I accept the envy, I'm much more likely to be able to control my behavior and act in a moral, kind manner. Or look at fear. I can embrace fear and still choose to act courageously. You see, courage is not about not having fear. Courage is about having fear and going ahead anyway. And the paradox is that when I accept the fear, I'm more likely to act courageously. The same with anger. Being angry is natural. The question is what I do with that anger. And you know that there is research that especially women reject anger. Why? Because it's not considered feminine. And what happens as a result? A few things. First of all, the anger only swells. Remember, don't think of a pink elephant. Don't be angry. You get more angry. Second, the anger has to come out somehow. How does it come out? One way is that you eventually blow up and have no control over the anger. And another way of anger coming out is through some physiological consequence. When we repress or suppress emotion, that emotion has to come out. And very often it comes out through some form of dis-ease or illness. Not all our illnesses are a result of psychological suppression, but many of our illnesses are. Now, how do we express emotion? How do we express anger? Do we blow up? Not necessarily. How do we express sadness? How do we express anxiety? Well, let me share with you 3 ways of doing it. One is by talking about it. It's not a coincidence that we feel so much better after talking to our best friend about something we feel or about how angry we are. So talking about it, whether it's to a therapist, to a best friend, to our partner or colleague. Another way of expressing emotion is through writing. There's a lot of research by Jamie Pennybaker, Laura King, and others on the importance of writing about our emotions, expressing them either on paper or on the computer. And people who do that enjoy less anxiety, are less likely to be sad in the long term, and are overall happier and more social and physically healthier because they express rather than suppress their emotions. So writing about it is a second way of giving yourself the permission to be human. Another way is shedding tears. You know that there's research today showing that when we cry, we release oxytocin. Oxytocin is the love hormone. It makes us feel all good and warm and fuzzy inside. When we cry, we release opiates. These are drugs, naturally occurring drugs that calm us, that help us feel better, which we do after a good cry because it's a form of expressing rather than suppressing our emotions. Now, this is especially important for people working in your profession. You know, Mary Kay spoke about selling as service. And there is research on service providers. You see, service providers can't always express their emotions, give themselves the permission to be human. When they ask you, so, how are you doing? How are you? And you're, making a sale, you can't tell, oh, thank you so much for asking. I had a terrible argument with my partner, or I'm having a terrible day today. No, you put on a smile and you say, I'm doing great. How are you? You're not giving yourself the permission to be human at that point. Now, there may be colleagues or even clients that you can speak to like that and be completely open. But in most cases, you probably cannot or don't want to. So they did research on service providers who have to smile even when they feel like crying, who have to talk about happy, wonderful things even when they want to talk about how angry or upset they are. What do they do? How do they give themselves the permission to be human? Well, here's the thing. Very often, service providers, individuals who are in sales, for instance, pay a very high price for suppressing their emotion unless they have a place, a space in their lives where they let these emotions out. Whether it's after work and they go home and they speak to their partner, whether it's at work with their best friend, where they share their real emotions, whether it's being by themselves and just shedding a tear after a hard day or a hard sale. There must be periods during the day when they give themselves the permission to be human, when they are authentic, real, when they let it out, when they invite the emotions in. So it's okay to put on that facade, to put on that smile, even when you don't feel like it, if later on you can release, you can let out. You can give yourself the permission to be human. Now, that's important on so many levels. First of all, people who give themselves the permission to be human are more likely to experience anti-fragility, to grow as a result of hardship. It also turns out that the foundation of happiness is first allowing in unhappiness, the permission to be human. I want to move on to a second condition that we can put in place as leaders, as friends, as family members, a condition that we can help increase the likelihood of anti-fragility for ourselves and for those around us. And that has to do with the stress pandemic. This came long before the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what is the stress pandemic? You see, all over the world, levels of stress are rising. Now, this was the case before COVID. Today, stress levels are at an all-time high. Let's look at some of the headlines from newspapers from 2 years ago or longer. So in the newspapers, more and more organizations are seeing stress as problematic, as hurting creativity and productivity and leading to burnout and breakdown. More and more doctors are talking about stress as the silent killer. Now we see this all over the world, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in North America, whether it's in China, whether it's in Australia. Stress levels are a problem. Now, what do we do about these rising levels of stress that so many of us are experiencing? Well, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will all be a lot calmer. But really, what do we do about rising stress levels? So here's the thing. You see, my colleagues and I, over the past 2 decades or so, have been studying stress. And what we found initially surprised us. In hindsight, in retrospect, it looks obvious, but our findings initially surprised us. What we found was that actually stress is not the problem. We found that actually stress potentially is good for us. What does this mean? Let me explain. So think about the following analogy, an analogy that I used just, a few minutes ago. So when you go to the gym and you lift weights, what are you doing to your muscles? You're putting stress on them. We talked about it. Now, is that a problem, the stress? No, it's actually potentially good for us. You go to the gym and you lift weights, and 2 minutes later, you lift the same weights. And, 2 days after that, you go back to the gym and you lift weights again. And after 2 days following that, you go back and you lift weights. And that's how you grow stronger, bigger, healthier, better. Why? Because we are an anti-fragile system. Our muscles are. Stress is not the problem. Potentially, it's good for us. When do the problems begin? The problems begin when we go to the gym and we lift weights. And a minute later, we lift more weights, and then more weights and more weights. And the following day, we go back to the gym and again and again and again, and so on and so on. That's when the problems begin. That's when we get injured. That's when we get weaker rather than stronger. The problem, therefore, is not the stress. What is the problem? The problem is the lack of recovery, whether it's in the gym physiologically or in life psychologically. You see, what healthy, happy, and successful people do, whether successful personally or professionally, whether at home or as leaders, what these people do is they experience stress just like everyone else does. It's natural. The difference is that those healthy, happy, and successful people, they also introduce recovery throughout their lives. You see, we're very good at dealing with stress. We've always been good at it. So, 5,000 years ago, it was the stress of, the lion chasing us. Today, it's the stress of, a quarterly report or the pandemic. Now, these are stressful experiences, of course, but we can deal with them. We can handle them just like we always could. The difference in today's world compared to the past is that in the past, we had more time for recovery, whereas today, we're on all the time. No recovery, no anti-fragility. You see, what recovery does is trigger the anti-fragile system. Without recovery, we're fragile. With recovery, we're anti-fragile. Without recovery, we break down, we burn out. With recovery, we grow stronger, healthier, better off. Happy, healthy, successful people energize their crazy busy lives with periods of recovery on 3 levels: micro, mid, and macro level. Let me share with you these examples of these 3 levels of recovery, beginning with micro level recovery. Micro level recovery is about taking a break, every 2 hours or so, taking a 15-minute break, and the break could be for having a cup of coffee or walking, exercising, or meditating, if that's your thing, or having lunch with a friend, but not lunch when you're on the phone and working at the same time. That's not recovery. That's simply more stress. Let me give you a few concrete examples. Let me elaborate on exercise. So when it comes to exercise, there is research showing that regular physical exercise, that's 30 minutes, 3 times a week of exercise, has the same effect on our psychological well-being as our most powerful psychiatric medication. 30 minutes of walking or jogging or swimming, or the best form of exercise, dancing or playing ball, whatever. 30 minutes 3 times a week has the same effect on our psychological well-being as our most powerful psychiatric medication. In fact, it works in the same way. It releases norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. These are the feel-good chemicals in the brain. Now, does this mean that we can, if we are on medication, we can just throw it out and start exercising? Not so quickly. Obviously, do it only, if you want to try, do it only with the supervision of a psychiatrist, of the doctor. But the research clearly shows that the effect of physical exercise is the same as medication. It also helps us concentrate better. It helps us recover from stress. Then there is also mid-level recovery. Mid-level recovery is about getting a good night's sleep. There's a lot of research coming out of the University of California, Berkeley, Stanford, University of San Diego on the importance of sleep. For some reason, the good research on sleep comes out of California. I don't know if it's a coincidence or what, but it's important research showing that getting good night's sleep helps us think better. It makes us nicer, kinder towards other people. It significantly improves our physical health, and it's an important form of recovery that triggers the anti-fragile system. It's not just sleep that's an important form of mid-level recovery. It's also taking a day off. And then there is macro-level recovery. This is about taking a vacation, whether it's a month or 2 weeks or a week, time off. Now, what does that vacation, what does that time off look like? Depends on you. For some of you, it may be lying on the beach and doing nothing. For others, it may be reading books. And yet for others, it may be, climbing a mountain or doing, the Iron Woman. Whatever it is, find your form of recovery and apply it. Now, you didn't get to where you are at Mary Kay without a lot of ambition, a lot of hard work, and obviously success. And for you, it may be difficult to take time off, to introduce recovery. Why? Because you don't want to stop. You don't want to slow down. You want to continue pushing and working hard and being ambitious. And that's important if you also introduce recovery. Think about the following analogy. You're a racing driver. You go around the track again and again and again. And you need to take a pit stop. And you say to yourself, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to slow down. I'm going to continue racing around the track. What happens to your car if you don't stop? One of two things will happen. Either you run out of fuel or your tires blow up. And that's what happens to millions and billions of people around the world. And by the way, today, more than ever. This is what happens to highly successful, highly ambitious people who refuse to take time off, who refuse to introduce recovery on the micro, mid, and macro level in their lives. And if you want to trigger your anti-fragile system rather than breaking down and being fragile, you must do it. You must introduce what I've come to call islands of sanity throughout your crazy busy days, weeks, lives. How? By giving yourself the permission to be human. By whether it's taking time to shed a tear or to talk to a dear friend or a coach or to write about what you're going through. Otherwise, you'll burn out. Otherwise, you'll break fragile rather than grow, be anti-fragile. Take care of yourself by giving yourself time for recovery, whether it's by exercising regularly or taking 3 or 4 deep breaths regularly, or getting a good night's sleep or resting, taking a day off or a vacation, taking that pit stop so that you trigger the anti-fragile system that turns stress into growth and development. So yes, take care of others and take care of yourselves, because this is how leaders contribute to their own success and to the success of all stakeholders involved, whether it's their employees, the people working with them, whether it's their customers, whether it's the community. And if we remember to take care of ourselves and take care of others, that is how we contribute to ourselves, to our families, to our organizations, and to a better world. And isn't this what leadership is about? Isn't this what you do day in and day out in your inspiring organization? Thank you.